We recently visited the Queensland Air Museum at Canberra on the Sunshine Coast. Restoration efforts started in 1973, and this museum was opened in 1987, boasting over 80 historic military and civilian aircraft on a 2-hectare property. There was too much to cover during our short visit, so we asked the president of the museum, Garry, if a few of the volunteers could take us through some of the highlights with a focus on military aircraft. We were also treated to a quick takeoff and landing in their Boeing 737-800 simulator. If you are travelling to the Queensland Sunshine Coast, be sure to drop into the Queensland Air Museum, as I'm sure you will not be disappointed. We started our tour with Bukmanis, a retired RAAF Air Electronics officer, talking to us about the Neptune in Australian service.
The aeroplane basically started its life as a bomber, and you can see that sort of configuration in the big bomb doors and what would probably have been gun turrets. They changed the role to surveillance, basically ASW, in other words, anti-submarine warfare. First thing they did was put that big dome on the aeroplane there, and that's a radar. Back in those days, the submarines had to come to the surface, and of course they were susceptible to being picked up by radar. After a time though, submarines went nuclear and then did not have to surface anymore. Now we've got a different ball game altogether, so we have to use different technology. That technology involves listening. Sound travels for a long way underwater, so we drop devices into the water to listen. That sound is transmitted back to the aeroplane, and it was my job to analyse whether that sound came from a ship, a submarine, or a whale. That's basically ASW in a nutshell, but it does tend to be a bit more complicated than that. The aeroplane itself, as it got more and more technology put into it, got heavier. If you look at the aeroplane, you'll notice that it has a rather unique feature in that it's got 2 big propeller engines, and then on the outside of that, 2 jet engines. Very rare. The rationale was, of course, that as the aeroplane got heavier, the 2 guys up the front found that it was very difficult to get the aeroplane off the ground. So they upgraded the engines as far as they could, but it still wasn't enough, and they put 2 jet engines on it. Unfortunately, jet engines love to run off Avtur, which is basically kerosene. We were already running petrol. The life of the jet engines tended to be rather short. We only ever used it for takeoff and landing. They did work, they did increase the speed a lot, but the fuel gauge went to 0 very, very quickly as well. A very prominent position, of course, is the nose, normally occupied by the junior navigator. When you realise that the sonobuoys needed to be tracked again, the sonobuoys being the listening devices, the man there was in the ideal position to bring the aeroplane back onto any particular position. Also, it's an excellent position for search and rescue with good all-round visibility. And in fact, I have been sitting there when we found the survivors from a boat called the One and All, and they were down to their last flare, and the flare came up out of the water over the aeroplane and over the wing. It's been written up in a book called Great Sea Rescues, and it's interesting to then read the other side. And because they were down to their last flare, they said, they're either going to see us or we're going to shoot them down. And I was sitting in that front position at the time. As I mentioned earlier, the aeroplane's got both propeller engines and 2 jet engines. And then on the outside of the wings, there is extra fuel tanks. The fuel tank on that wing has a covered perspex area that normally wouldn't be covered. It's covered because the perspex is crazy. And there's a 70 million candle power searchlight in there. That's a very good idea on the end of a fuel tank. So it did work. It would light up the ocean very well, but we had very strict limits as to how long it could be on, and then had to cool again. Two entrances to the aeroplane. One here, you can just see the ladder coming down. That goes up into a tunnel here. A lot of entrances, a lot of the getting into and out of the aeroplane is a hands and knees type job. So up that ladder into the tunnel and you pop up a hatch. Anyone after the aeroplane would normally get in via the rear hatch. There are normally 10 crew, 2 pilots up there in the front, 3 navigators and 5 of me, AEOs. Bombay. Okay, the cleanest, neatest Bombay I've ever seen in my life. It's a credit to the guys that have done the aeroplane up. In normal circumstances, there would be another big fuel tank in there and a pannier box here that we would carry our suitcases and tools for going away. During any conflict, we would carry torpedoes, and that's a mock-up of what a torpedo would look like. There are self-homing torpedoes, so once we got to within a short range of our target, we would hopefully drop that and it would find its own way. While we're here, it's just of interest to note that this aeroplane last flew in 1975 and went up to a private museum in Mareeba on the Athbun tableland. It stayed there for years and years and years until such time as the museum went defunct and it was going to be scrapped. Our guys went up there and pulled it apart into that many bits, put it on a truck, bought it here, and have been putting it back together ever since. Okay, as an air electronics officer or AEO, after I graduated, this would probably be the first position that I would operate in, because we're already trained up on the use of radios, radio procedure, and back in those days we still did Morse code as well. That soon gave way to a teleprinter system which was located here, but already you can see that there's a lot of equipment, all of it's giving off heat. The aeroplane's not air conditioned, it's not pressurized, so the normal ceiling's 10,000 feet, and at best you've got a few air blowers. Normal flight time, 10 hours, 10 crew, 10 hours. If you're going away on a longer trip, like to Hawaii for RIMPAC, you would carry another 4 crew, 4 ground crew with you. 2 of them are here, 2 on the flight deck. As you can see, not the most comfortable seat.
Very squishy.
Very squishy. But a lot of the friendships I made all those years ago, I've still got. And you've seen that from my conversations with the guys out there. It's the little kitchenette that you're in, and that's my old fry pan, which I've donated to the museum. Okay, everything in this part of the aeroplane was sort of referred to as the ordnance section. If you look across the back of the aeroplane, you'll see that there are a lot of empty racks. Each rack would contain one of these sonobuoys. They are listening devices. They're expendable. Once they're dropped in the ocean, they serve their purpose for a period of time and then sink. That's it, gone. The way they work is that there are rotary wings on one end. They come out, rotate, slow it down so that it doesn't destroy itself when it hits the water. Some of the later ones actually had a parachute to slow it down. When it hits the water, the bottom end drops off and a long wire goes down with a hydrophone and it listens. The top end springs off and an aerial comes up. It's now a radio. Everything that it's listening to in the water is transmitted back to the aeroplane. The main analytical position is at the front of the aeroplane. In this particular case, it was done on paper charts. So we were looking for patterns and frequencies to determine whether we were looking for or listening to a ship, a submarine, or a whale. These days, it's done with more computerized systems. Everything had to be loaded at the right time, in the right sequence, while the aeroplane's moving and turning quite severely at times. Normally a junior AEO position, and as you can see yourself, there is a tendency sometimes to bounce off bits. So you could come out looking a bit blue around the shoulders. As well as sonobuoys, we would carry smoke markers, little signals underwater sound, or PDCs, basically a little bomb. Very simplistically, if you think of a sonobuoy as a listening device, and if you drop a bang on it, that bang will go bang, the noise goes out in the water, and if there is something there, hopefully you would get an echo, and you've got basic sonar. Some of the sonobuoys actually do ping on their own. The problem with any of that sort of technology is as soon as you go active making bangs or pings, the submarine knows you were there and he's gone. Very much a cat and mouse game even today. In the tropics, we would fly with these windows open. You wouldn't want to put your finger out there because at 180 knots, but it does pull that air out of the aeroplane and cool it off. As you've noticed, a lot of the boxes, when they're operating, they're giving off heat. Everything's old technology with valves, transformers, and heat. 10 hours, 10 crew, you either got along or you got out. Well, it was the junior AO's job to carry the cooking gear. For 10 hours, you're gonna get hungry. We had quite good rations. Normally steak, bread, tomatoes, lettuce, so a steak sandwich was quite the go. If you had time, somebody'd come back here, cook steak sandwiches or just toasties, pass them back across the main spar. Generally the pilots would eat first. If we had a particularly important mission such that nobody was able to cook, the first guy that volunteered would make a sandwich, pass it to the front, and it was not uncommon to have a bite out of every corner as it got to the front. Also, the guy that volunteered to cook, inevitably by the time he'd made food for 9 others, wasn't hungry anymore. Because the airplane's not flying straight and level. And as you can see, you're cooking sideways and it's not very comfortable. The Neptunes were replaced from about the mid-1970s with the first P3B Orions. The Orion behind me is a C model, externally virtually identical, inside chalk and cheese as technology improved. The Aeroplanes themselves were manufactured or modified from a Lockheed Electra passenger aeroplane in the United States. We lost one on pickup. Unfortunately, the nose wheel collapsed and it caught fire and burnt to the ground, but all the crew got out. It was then proved that it wasn't the fault of the crew, but a fault in the actual nose wheel. We got a new aeroplane out of it. 4 big Ellison turboprop engines that can now take you where you want to go very quickly. But as we've learnt or talked about with the Neptune, we're still in a pattern of listening. So having got to where we want to go, it's quite incumbent to slow down as much as we can. The aeroplane's quite good in that regard, in that it can close one engine down, it can even close 2 engines down and fly quite successfully. Big silver panel there contains a little jet engine of its own that runs a generator. Right. So on the ground, if you haven't got a facility for a plug-in generator, you can run that. It's called an auxiliary power unit, or APU. Unfortunately, it is very loud. We all would wear ear protection, but even with ear protection, it was very, very loud. I can't remember the exact figures, but we're talking threshold of pain loud. Torpedoes would be the main armament in ASW. The aeroplane now is fitted with hard points on the wing, and it can carry missiles. Back in the B models that I was flying, we didn't have that facility.
Joining us on the day to talk about the Orion was former RAAF pilot Barry Collins, who, like Val, spent significant time on this aircraft.
Talking about defence of this aircraft now, it was used in the war against terror for about 10-year period over there, based out of Al Minhad, Dubai's military base, and they would be flying around about 25,000 feet over the sand, over the desert, the whole time. The threat was missiles, and the electronic warfare officer in this aircraft, his head, her head, was full of all the information required, as well as the equipment, to let you know when the threat was on its way inbound and from whence it was coming. All right, so the electronic warfare officer would give us a bearing. And when I say us, the pilots in the front, and as soon as you got that, you turned straight onto that bearing, and then we were able to push one of 2 buttons in the cockpit, one for each of the captain and one for the co-pilot, which is a red button with disperse written on it, and that let the flares go out of here, which is why we're standing here. This is symmetrical on the other side of the nose wheel, and also on the outside of both engine nacelles. So you'd push the disperse button, the flares would all scream out there and hopefully give another heat source for the heat-seeking missile to go to. So you've turned towards the missile now and putting those great big jet engine exhausts there, the T56A14 Ellisons, all the heat coming out, all 4 of those, we don't want that pointing at the missile anymore. So that's the reason we're going to turn towards it. Don't ask me whether they ever had, during that 10-year period, any instances where they needed to do that. By then I was flying for Cathay Pacific Airways out of Hong Kong. So that's what that's all about. And this is just a photographic facsimile of where those flares were. But you just walked underneath the forward radar, and there's one in the tail as well. So you'll get a 360-degree electronically white man's magic type of image presentation on a screen. So there's one radar there and one at the back. Also in the back is the sting of the magnetic anomaly detector, and we need to be low for that. All right, so you've located the submarine, you've got a good position on it, and we're going to fly over the top of that position, and the MAD equipment will pick up the anomaly in the Earth's magnetic field being straight lines like that. The anomaly in the field be created by a lump of metal submarine is going to be what's picked up by the equipment. And as you fly over that, there's typical MAD, MAD, MAD is the call, and at that point the weapon can go in the water, because you know that you're exactly on top of it. Bomb bay, torpedoes, depth charges. Underneath the wings, outside of both of the engines on port and starboard wing, would be 2 Harpoon missiles, and the Harpoon missiles was our air-to-surface armament. against ships, surface shipping. So they had a range of about 50 or 60 nautical miles. All right. Now, if we look at the engines across here, you'll note that the blades on 1, 2 and 3 are in a flying condition. This one here is feathered. So that's in a position where the aircraft has suffered a fire or a failure in that engine. And so you go through the drill of shutting it down and it ends up with the blades feathered like that. Obviously, with it shut down, if they were like that, it'd create insupportable drag and you'd never get home. You'd use up all the fuel trying to get home. But it's not only for fire or failure that we shut it down. Once we're on task, we can also deliberately shut it down like that for loiter, is the term the US Navy would use. And so that enables you now to burn less fuel and stay on task longer. It's simple, right? Yep. So we'd shut that down like that, and we could fly all the way down on 3 engines down to prosecute submarines. As the aircraft weight got lighter, as you burned up more fuel, you could also shut down number 4 engine. So now you're operating on 2 only, right? With generators on both, providing everything that the aircraft needed for hydraulics and electrics. But you were limited then to 1,000 feet. If we wanted to descend below 1,000 feet, we'd have to relight number 4 engine. Simple. And then away you go, you fly the aircraft. So it's a great aircraft to fly. Like I said before when we were talking privately, out of all the flying I've done in half a century, 25,000 hours, this is my favourite, by far. And the Neptune not far behind. You know, the big jets when I went to Cathay Pacific, they were fun and they provided a good living. But this jet, I just love coming into this aeroplane because it brings back so many memories of flying with trusted and true friends and crews. Typically you'd have 12 people in a crew on this one, and in the Neptune over there that was 10. Now these are gender non-specific. In the Neptune, this is an interesting anecdote, you only had toilet facilities for gentlemen. So there were a couple of funnels, one behind the main spar, which you saw before with Val, and one at the front. If you needed to go any further than that in your ablutions, there was a can down the back. And whoever wanted to use it would have to be the one responsible for cleaning it up.
The aeroplane has virtually gone from a crew of 10 to 12. Can be more, can be less, depending on the mission that you're actually flying. But basically, we're still talking about 10 hours, but now with 12 crew. The extra 2 people are the 2 flight engineers, and we'll discuss that when we get up the front. 10 hours, just as in the Neptune, you get hungry. This time though, we can sit down. We've got a coffee pot on, so come back at any time and have a cup of coffee. If things are particularly slow or boring, we have a couple of bunks. The longest I've been airborne on an Orion is 15 hours. It's continuous. Normal flight's 10, but it can be extended up to 20. But you would plan for a 20-hour flight. It wouldn't just sort of eventuate. The early B models, just like the Neptune, we could cook. Steak sandwiches were lovely. As the aeroplane got more and more computerized, the fumes did not agree with the computers. Did we throw out the computers? No, we threw out the steak sandwiches and went to TV type dinner meals. You know, now you can survive off them, but steak sandwiches are something else again. This one's got a toilet. Neppy doesn't.
So what did you do on the Neptune if you didn't go to the toilet?
We had a funnel, or if you got cut short, there was a bucket. All male crew, not a problem.
Yeah.
That was the normal dress for flight. Nomex type flying suit, jacket, because as with anything that's air conditioned, you can never ever get it right for everyone. Some want it hotter, some want it colder. Most of them wanted it colder, so I always found it was easier just to put on a jacket or take it off. Okay, these are your main analysis positions. Again, on the earlier models that I was familiar with, they were more manual. I would be sitting in the same position, but instead of a computer screen, I would have paper charts. If you look at these positions, they all look the same. They all look the same because they're computer screens. And it's not the computer, it's what's on it that's important. If you were to ask me what the actual presentation looked like these days, I haven't got a clue. I haven't got a clue. I can tell you what it looked like in 1980, but I don't have a clue now.
What were the typical stations?
2 sound analysis stations, and you'll see that they're marked acoustics. So traditionally you would have AEOs sitting here and they would be analysing that sound from the sonoboards. This position here, he's the sensor employment manager and also in charge of cameras. The aircraft's fitted with video and infrared, so it can see at night. He's also the, as I said, the sensor employment manager, because you can vary who's looking at what on which screen. For instance, if you were just on a general fisheries surveillance, the radar becomes important and that position is still there, but there's no reason why it can't be backed up with one of these guys because you're not now listening. Cameras, radar, and as far as I know, still the MAD analysis would come up on there as well. Again, back on the B model, this was the traditional round radar with lots of buttons and knobs and dials. Now it's computer screen. Electronic warfare, yes, the aeroplane's got the capability to intercept electronic signals. This bloke here, TACO stands for Tactical Coordinator. The aeroplane needs to have someone in charge of what tactics are being employed at any one particular time. In the first instance, sure, we're going to go out there and lay a pattern of sonobuoys. Then we get something. What happens then? Panic! No. There is a set procedure and sometimes that has to be varied. The tactical coordinator is in charge of that job. His right-hand man here is the navigator. No longer charts and things, compasses, GPS, and it works very well.
So, Jen, welcome to our AP3C cockpit, A9760 at the QAM. Big roomy cockpit, 2 pilots, captain, co-pilot, everything is duplicated, the thrust levers, the controls, the gear handles to bring the gear up and down, just the one flap lever over there. The middle seat is the flight engineer. Now, we're often asked by kids when they come in here on tours, gee, there's an awful lot of stuff in here, how much of it do you need to know? And my answer to that is if you can feel it, touch it, see it or use it, you've got to know 100% about it. The flight engineer needs to know a lot more because behind the camera here is a circuit breaker panel. So they're all there for emergency procedures to shut equipment down if you need to. There's the emergency handles. I was talking about how to shut the aircraft engines down before. If we shut it down with that, and it's just a simple matter of pulling it out like that, and that's called an E-handle, emergency handle, and that does 9 things, some of which are feathering the prop, shutting down the fuel, shutting down the oil, shutting down the generator cooling air, pulling the generator spline out of the auxiliary drive box. And once that's out, you can't restart the engine. So that's it, right? That stays there and you go home. Up here, you've got propeller controls, feather buttons here, used by the flight engineer for when we shut it down for loiter, as we discussed outside underneath the engine. All right, so we've got emergency exits here. There's one above the roof there, another one over to the side. We would typically have in these aircraft 2 pilots, sometimes a 3rd pilot for relief duty, and certainly there's 2 flight engineers. So one here and one will be having a rest down the back. I'll just bring the yoke back. these are part of what we would call a glass cockpit, right? They're just mini glass panels in here. And as you'll see when I take you through the 737 later, they're bigger than that, okay? So originally, the original P3Cs and P3B Orions before that didn't have that. They had an attitude indicator and an HSI, which was a horizontal situation indicator, basically a big compass that we could use, and that's what you had. So the attitude indicator was a bigger one of that. This is a standby one. There's one here and one for the co-pilot as well. So the information on these now is a primary flight display of an attitude indicator and a navigation display as well. So that's very modernised and completely different to the previous aircraft that was a P3C update 2 prior to this going through the modification process that you spoke about before. So this became the AP3C, the A for Australia, and this is just minor bits of it. The good guts of the whole thing is back there, what we're doing with the aircraft. So one really pleasant thing about flying these aeroplanes was that you were a tight-knit crew. You were put into a crew and it would last for a long time. And so you got to trust each other and you became very friendly, and your wives and your girlfriends and partners, they all became friendly as well. So whenever we were away, like in Hawaii for a horrible time, 5 weeks on of exercise in Hawaii, it sounds horrible, doesn't it? But a long time away from home, the wives would get together too and, be able to sort of compare notes with, has he bought you anything at the PX yet? Has he told you about the sheets and towels that were on sale yet? that sort of thing. No, but it's the camaraderie, the trust that I mentioned just a minute ago, that's just crazily important. And I loved it. I just loved being part of the crew, as I did with the Neptune as well before this time. Yeah. And you realise that the crew is trusting you not to put them in the water. I'm trusting the navigator, and everybody's trusting the navigator not to get us lost over land when we shouldn't be. And for the back-enders down there, we're trusting them to pick up the missiles if they're incoming and get the right information so that we don't waste their time and know how to use it. And that happens. Yep. It's a great job. Maritime reconnaissance, anti-submarine warfare, surveillance, and as I said, most of that flying over the war against terror out of Al Minhad was over the sand. 25,000 hours or thereabouts. Some flying was done over the sea, and that was done against Somalian pirates. So you've seen the movie Mr. Phillips with Tom Hanks, against those guys.
Barry then took us over to the Boeing 737-800 simulator to give us an introductory flying lesson.
So basically you've got a yoke in front of you, right? That steering wheel, we call it a yoke. When you pull it back, that's what the aeroplane does. When you push it forward, that's what the aeroplane does, all right? To roll it to the left or the right, you're going to turn the yoke handle, right? You're going to turn it around. Now, if you leave that yoke in the position that you've got it to roll into the bank, if you leave it there, this is what happens. It just keeps going around. So once you've got the bank on that you need for the turn, say you want it there, you recenter the yoke to where it is now, like that, straight up and down, and it will hold that bank angle. We also require just a little bit of backstick too, because the secondary effect of roll is pitch. So when you do that, the nose wants to drop. Okay, so that's the basics. The rudders, I'll stay away from those for you. However, when you come gliding down at Caboolture Gliding Club with us and you want to come learn how to fly gliders, you're going to be using the rudders a lot, okay? There's lots to learn here. This is a glass cockpit, and you recall out in the P3 I was talking about the glass panels, how they were a lot bigger in here. You've got the primary flight display, which is the one that's got the attitude on it. The other one next to it is the nav display. All of that is duplicated. You fly it manually, but when we get airborne, we put the autopilot in. And that's exactly what an airline crew would do. And then we fly it through this thing here, which is called the MCP, the mode control panel, with the autopilot on and a flight director, which is magenta bars which go vertically and horizontal down through the middle. When we've got that like that, you fly it through this. If you don't want to fly through that, we can disengage the autopilot here. Your button is on the left. It's just this one here that goes with your thumb. 2 clicks, bang, and it's disengaged. Okay, so just 2, 1, 2, not tick, tick. It won't recognise that. Thrust levers, we're going to use auto thrust, right? So I'll turn that on after takeoff, and that'll go like that after we set it there, all right? And it will hold the speed that we command here. Right. Once we get the autopilot on, you're controlling the speed and the heading to roll it and the altitude to which you're going to fly, all through that. Got it?
Got it.
All right, that's 101. Let's go flying. Standing by, 016, 220, put that back on. The arms, that's arm. That's the flight director can go back on, yep. Good, so we're not going to touch those two buttons there. That's going to do that. It'll give us a takeoff, go around thrust. Right. We're just going to pull them up here like that. So if you want to put your left hand up there with the thumb on top of that, that's it. Yep. Down here with your right hand. Don't touch those black buttons down underneath or on the side. And we've got the flaps set. We're ready to go. We're going to a circuit of Brisbane. This is runway 01 right with the Qantas hangar here, the terminal building over there, Moreton Bay in front of us, Brisbane City behind us.
Right.
You all set?
All right.
Okay. Stand up the thrust levers. Push them all the way through. Now look out to the front, out here down the dotted line, okay?
Right.
That's it. We're going to hang on to these thrust levers like that. And I'm steering the aircraft with the rudder pedals at the moment.
All right.
And then we're accelerating away and we do a power check. We say 80 knots, check. And we make sure we've got the thrust we want and that we're not incapacitated on the other side. And when we get to V1, which is our decision speed, we'll take our hand off thrust levers like now, V1, and rotate. Bring it back. And we're going to hold it about there, just like that. Positive rate, bring the gear up. And that's the attitude that we're going to hold there just for now. And we're going to start bringing the flaps in. We'll clean it up. You can see the speed tape is on the left there. The speed is accelerating to this speed here. This one, okay? So the auto thrust is now on. We're going to go to 2,000 feet so that we can go past the city. We're going to start thinking about levelling off very shortly. Flaps up. Gear unlocked. And there we are. Okay. So you can see that you need a little bit of forward pressure on that. Okay, that's a good enough height there. We'll call it 1800, that's good. All right, so now I'm going to put the autopilot in. All right, so take your hand off. Just go. There we go. Got the autopilot's now in control of this thing. Heading select. If you want to turn around to the left now, I want you to turn this here. You don't need to touch the yoke anymore because the auto, take your hand off the yoke, you're flying it through here. So let's turn that now onto 196 to the left. Yeah, the heading. Yeah, just turn that knob all the way around. Keep it going. Here, you can go faster than that. All the way to 196, which is the reciprocal of our takeoff heading, okay? And you can see the aircraft's doing it for us. That's the way. You got it. Look at that. We're at 2,000 feet, 1,800. We're coming around Redcliffe Peninsula there. We'll come back around. We'll do the circuit around the other side of Brisbane. So this is what you do in the jet in real time. Once you get airborne and we get the thing cleaned up, that autopilot goes on. Yeah. Because you've got to put up with this. Radio.
All right.
Now this is going to spook the rest of this, so I'll turn it off again. We don't need to listen to that in here right now, but that's what it's doing to you when you're actually flying. All right, so we're coming around now 90 degrees to go to that heading. And we're monitoring the whole thing. We don't sit back with our arms folded, but we could monitor the thing, have your hand down here ready to grab it. At any time that the automatics decide to go squirrely, we have to take over straight away. And then you just return to the way you learnt to fly in the Cessna when you were 16. All right, we're coming around to this downwind heading now. This is Redcliffe Peninsula out to the right, Nudgee Creek over there. And you'll see the airfield very shortly. Just on the horizon at 11 o'clock, you can see the two towers sticking up off Mount Cootha. And there's the city here. We'll go past the city and come back in and round from there. Most people ask what the simulator software is. It's ProSim. Does that mean anything to you?
I was thinking it was the Microsoft Flight Simulator.
No, it's ProSim. We've got a visuals computer out this side and the other one out the other side. So what we're doing now is we're on what's called the downwind heading, and this would be under radar vectors. They would say turn right now, heading 196, maintain 1,800. And we would read that back. And once we come round to land, we can't land at this speed, 220 knots, we'd burst all the tyres. Right. So now we've got to return it to what it was for the takeoff. So we've got to gradually slow it down and get the flaps out and the gear out. All right, we'll do that sequentially and you'll get used to that. As we just go up here a little bit further, we're going to set some flaps. So let's go to flap 1 and you would tell me flap 1.
Right, flap 1.
And I'd go speed checks, flaps 1. Now what you're going to do now is wind up there and bring it, the magenta bug on the speed tape, bring it back to the little green 1. All the way back, keep it coming, cover the 1. That's it.
Right.
So now the auto thrust is doing its thing. It's going to reduce to that speed, which is the minimum speed with flap 1 now.
Right.
All right, so these are always going to be the minimum speed that you can fly in the current configuration. Okay. So it's coming back to flap 1. We better get an approach speed in there as well. FMC approach for 30 flap, there it is. So that's the green ref now at the bottom of that speed tape. You can see the green REF.
Yeah. That'll
be our approach speed, okay? All right, there's Brisbane over there. The runways were just back to the left behind the wing.
Right.
You're having fun so far?
Yeah.
Good. That's what it's all about, flying.
Trying to get my head around all the different.
Well, I know it's an awful lot to kind of take in. I just wanted you to be the pilot as well, and
Yeah.
rather than just me fly it and then you don't get anything out of it.
Yeah.
So there you go. So we're just going to go out here. These are waypoints in there for the ILS approach, the instrument landing system approach. We won't be flying the instrument landing system approach. We're just going to do a visual by coming around the other side of Brisbane and back in around to the left.
Okay.
All right, there's Mount Cootha there now. On the just left of the nose is Flinders Peak, and about 17 nautical miles out to 1 o'clock is Amberley.
Yeah.
You can see Lang Park coming in now, or Suncorp Stadium if you want to call it that. Story Bridge down here. The other side of the city you can see the Gabba, the home of the Mighty Lions. With the opening round of the season this year is 16th of March against Geelong there. Wouldn't miss it. So we're coming down here on the downwind thing. So we're getting it dirtied up, getting it prepared for landing. We're about 6 nautical miles from the threshold now. So we'll put out flap 5 now. So you say flap 5.
5.
Speed checks, flaps 5, back to there, and you're going to wind that around to the 5 now on that speed tape. That's it. See the little green 5?
Yep.
You're a natural. Look at that. And it's slowing down now. You watch that, we monitor it and we make sure it's slowing down, okay?
Yeah.
All right. Now I'm going to take over visually as we come around base. Oh, there's the Gateway Bridge there now at 10 o'clock across the river. All right. We'll end up flying this manually very shortly. Well, let's do it about now. Get rid of the flight directors. Give myself this thing here. It's called the bird, the flight path vector. If you can disengage the autopilot for me if you like. Two clicks. Good man. Right. Now we're flying it manually. Okay. The autopilot's not flying this for us anymore, but the auto thrust is still in.
Okay.
There's the city's gone past there. So now we're going to turn around here. I'll put the gear down, put the lights back on. I'll put the auto brake on too for the landing. We're going to come around here. We just aim to sort of get about 20 degrees of bank in there. And we don't want to descend it yet, so we just want to fly level. Like that. And we're going to come around over to Indooroopilly. My house is down here at Taringa, and there's Archerfield on the nose.
Oh, yeah.
That's the St Lucia golf course. All right, so it's pretty good viz, isn't it? It's good visuals.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're just going to roll that around there a little bit further. Just take off some of that bank. Bringing it around to the runway.
So what are all these stars?
They're waypoints.
Right.
So they're navigation waypoints that we can put into the thing. Here they all are in the flight management computer, and we can fly to any one of those.
Right.
They have speed and altitude limitations on them normally. Okay, I can see the runway now. Can you see off at 10 o'clock 2 red lights?
Yeah.
All right, well that's the PAPI, the precision approach path indicator. And because we're at this height and we're that close in, it's indicating that we're too low, but we're not. We're just maintaining the altitude. And then we're going to come around and we're going to line ourselves up on that localizer, which is the azimuth for the runway. We'll track in, and then the lights will change from red to white. Yep. We'll turn it around, and then we'll put some more flap out and we'll land it. All right, you see I'm turning onto it now.
Yep.
You can see the other runway. This is runway 01 right that we're going to. To the left, and a bit further out is some more red lights. That's runway 01 left, right? So typically they would use runway one of these for takeoffs and the other ones for landings at a busy period.
Yep.
All right, we're coming on to finals for this runway now. That's it. So we're flying it all visually at this time. All right, get some more flap out. Let's get that speed back a bit more. So I'll do all this now. And you can see we're just coming onto that glide slope now. You can see they're going white as well, white and red.
Yeah.
We just get it over onto the centre line. There it is. We're on our way down. Coming down. All good. Flap 30 and get this back to VREF +5. That's it. So we got the gear down, we got the flaps down, we've got a clearance. Now we can land. So we're going to land and we're going to pull it up on the runway straight ahead.
All right.
Some people say, do you ever fly under the Gateway Bridge? Well, no. There's Doomben and Eagle Farm out there, Story Bridge back around here.
Do you have to use the rudders at all except for landing?
Good question. If you had an engine failure on the runway or anywhere, yes, you would, because you need to counter the swing.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a great question. But as you initially landing using the rudders to maintain the centre line, and once you get down to 50 or 60 knots, we would normally go to the nose wheel tiller and steer the nose wheel directly from there. But we're not going to use that today. All right, so that's just slightly high there. And it doesn't look like it, but we're still 3 nautical miles back. And it's going to talk to us in a minute. It's going to start letting us know how low we are.
1,000.
And it won't shut up now, it'll talk a lot, like me. Alrighty. So we're on the glide slope, just slightly left of the centre line now. I'll just bring it back. That's a little bit of a computer. There's a little bit of wind in there, a couple of knots of wind. There we go. It's indicating slightly low, but we're not going to worry about that either, because the closer you get, the bigger those corrections are going to be.
Yeah.
All right, so that's on the slope now, and it should indicate that very shortly.
400. 300. Approaching minimums. 200. Minimums.
Continue. Now we don't worry about those lights now because they're just too close.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the centre line now.
100.
We're going to react to what it says to us, to the altitude now.
40. 30. 20. 10.
There we are, on the runway now. Bring it up. These are the thrust reversers. I've got the stick forward to hold it on there.
Yep.
So by bringing these up, it's put the reverse thrust in. And I've got some brake going on there. There we go. So I'm using some foot brake as well. We're on the centre line. These markers indicate how far from the end we are. So that's 2,000 feet from the end, then 1,500, 1,000.
Yeah.
Get rid of the reversers, pull it up on the centre line, look out to the side. Now we're stopped. And now you can set the park brake. If you put your feet up on the rudder pedals and depress the top of the rudder pedals, put your feet on and push them both down. Right, now bring your hand down here. There you go. Take your feet off the rudder pedals. So I'll put them back on again.
Oh yeah, just put them on.
Right, now take your feet off. There you go. Park brake set. Good stuff.
After the flight simulator, we went back outside to meet former RAF pilot John Lloyd to talk about some of the jets they have on display.
Our Hunter here has had a very interesting and checkered history. I think I'll just go back a little bit and talk about when the Hunter came into service and how it really fitted into military history. Because the real thing about the Hunter was that it's probably the most successful British post-war fighter jet. Over 2,000 of them were produced, and it served with over 21 air forces. It was an incredibly good aeroplane, but it was late into the supersonic or the swept wing fighter development. The Brits at the end of World War II didn't really think there was going to be another war for about 10 years. So the government slowed up development of swept wing fighter design. And it was only when the Cold War started in 1949 that they realized they had a bit of catch-up to do. And it just so happened that Sir Sidney Cam of Hawkers had already embarked on a program of private development of a single-seat swept-wing fighter jet, which culminated in the Hunter. And she first flew in 1951, quite a long time after the Sabre and the MiG, of course. The big advantage that the Hunter had was that they were able to capitalize on a lot of the research and development that had taken place on those two aeroplanes. So when it came into service effectively in 1954, after a lot of development problems, it was a very good interceptor for its age, but it had a very limited timescale as an interceptor because everything was going supersonic. You remember in the 50s, if it didn't go supersonic, nobody really wanted to consider it. And the large number of Hunters that had been produced or were on the drawing boards were actually brought to a sort of premature end to their career, partly because of the fact that the Lightning was coming in as the main interceptor in the UK, and had already been, the Century Series fighters had already taken over in America, and partly because the Minister of Defence in the UK in 1957 announced that the Air Force was going to stop all manned aircraft. And suddenly the Air Force went into a situation where it had this large number of interceptors, and they really didn't have a role. However, help was on the horizon, and most of the aircraft were transitioned into the ground attack role. And it was in the ground attack role that it really shone. So our aircraft here started out its life as a Hunter Mark 6 with a 7,500 pound Avon engine. And shortly after it had entered service, it was then converted into an FR-10, Fighter Reconnaissance 10. And this particular one saw service in Aden from about 1960. After 1960, it went back to the UK in about 1964, back to Hawkers. It was transitioned then into the Mark 74 that we've got here, and then given to the Singaporean Armed Forces. So that was the history of this particular aeroplane. To go back to the development of the Hunter, there are one or two lovely stories about what happened to it during its development. First of all, the early marks of the Avon engine, which they were using, had a very poor stall margin on the engine and had a tendency to flame out. So they messed around with a Bristol Siddeley engine, the Sapphire, which was a very successful engine, but it too had its problems. And eventually the Air Force decided to go mainline with the advanced Avon series for commonality with the Canberra, and also the development potential of the Avon had already proved itself. And the early marks of the Avon, when they tried to test fire the guns at high altitude, found that the surge margins were such that the engine flamed out when they fired the guns, which wasn't a very good idea for an interceptor at the time. So that problem was solved because they found that it was the blast train that was going back down into the intakes and effectively overfueling the engine. And that was taken care of by the simple precept of putting a blip switch on the throttle. Okay. When the guns were fired, there are chutes there where the cartridge cases came out and the links that held the rounds together in the bin, which is actually in the back there. It carried 150 rounds per gun as a matter of interest. Now, when the links came out at a high speed, the cartridge cases were sufficiently dense that they actually ejected clear of the aeroplane. But the links, being light steel, flew up and damaged the underside of the aircraft. So they decided that they needed to put collector tanks on, and these blisters here were not part of the original design, and they were added to collect the links. At the time, there was a very well-endowed British actress by the name of Sabrina, so naturally the collector tanks were then known as Sabrinas from then onwards. And that's the story of the blisters. As a ground attack weapon, just going forward, you can see that it's got 4 exit ports there for the 30mm cannon, Aden cannon. Although it only had 150 rounds per gun, in the devastating effect with a high explosive was actually particularly effective. And as a ground attack weapon, we used it in high explosive, armor piercing for light armor. And the Air Force that was probably most successful in using it operationally was the Indian Air Force. During the Indo-Pakistani wars, there were 2 of them, and the Hunter really distinguished itself in those wars. In addition to that, when I was flying this in Singapore in the 69-70, we were armed with SNEB rockets, which is a 79mm rocket, anti-tank rocket, and that we carried those in a pod. You could carry rockets, you could carry bombs, and it had an effective payload of about 10,000 pounds, which for an aircraft of its time was very effective.
And with just the 2 points on?
Yes, yeah, and the Singaporeans latterly added a station inboard from which they hung the Sidewinder, which gave it the really effective air-to-air capability. It was not designed as a supersonic aircraft, but you could get it to go supersonic in a dive. That's all very well. If you want the aircraft to go supersonic, you've got to do something with it. And so up to the transonic range, the wing was very efficient and the aircraft was very effective. Like all fighters, we used to operate at ultra-low level, and jet engines, as you know, are very thirsty at low level. So we used to have to carry the drop tanks. Now, in the fighter reconnaissance role, it carried 2 drop tanks on the stations to give it the range. It had 2 30-gallon drop tanks on the inboard and 3 30-gallon drop tanks and 100-gallon drop tanks outboard, just to increase its range. The addition on the Mark 9, which is the definitive defining sign of this aeroplane from the Mark 6, is the sawtooth edge. And because of the properties of span-wise flow, the aircraft had a very nasty habit of pitching up at very high angles of attack. And those pitch up angles or Gs could reach up to about 3G. And to stop or to control the span-wise flow, they put the sawtooth edge, called a dog tooth really. And that created a vortex which acted as a wing fence. And that effectively got over that problem. In the development phase, they actually used flaps for air brakes, which did cause stability problems. And eventually they put on the independent air brake at the back there, which it didn't create any serious aerodynamic problems and solved the problem. Because it was a very slippery aeroplane at low speed. In the low speed case, killing speed was an interesting situation. Okay, now up in the tail here, that's an all-flying tail. It's got an elevator and it's got the elevator and the all-flying tail side of it, and you could lock them up for supersonic flight. Of course, they found in the early days of particularly at the end of World War II, the phantom dives that the fighters used to get into, you're probably familiar with. And one of the features of that was that the aircraft could get into the transonic range, and they really didn't know what was happening. And one of the features of it was that they couldn't pull out because the pilot had insufficient strength or control over the tailplane to be able to pull out. And that's why one of the features of getting over that transonic shock wave is to have the all-flying tail. The Hunter was probably, if you speak to anybody about it, it was probably the most delightful aeroplane that anybody has had the opportunity of flying. It handled beautifully, right down to very low speeds. And in combat, its maneuverability was, well, should we say, breathtaking. On the Mark 9, which is different from the Mark 6, you'll see it's got this blister up at the end here, and that was for a tail parachute. This aircraft was operated in Aden, which of course is on the Arabian Peninsula, and operating it at the temperatures they did. If you look at the tyres, they're very high pressure tyres, and overheating the brakes was very easy. So it had a tail parachute there, so you just stream that at fairly high speed, and then you jettison it on the runway. That's what that blister is for. And you can see that we've got the logo here for the Singaporean Armed Forces. When the Brits pulled out of east of Suez in the early 70s, Singapore was actually left looking after its own defence. And that's how they bought hunters from the Air Force. The Air Force handed over a lot of them, but effectively they had to buy their own Air Force or airplanes, and they set up an air defence capability with the Hunter. As an air defence fighter, okay, as long as you kept it as long as you were fighting subsonic aircraft. We don't have the gun pack here, but the gun pack actually comes out as a complete unit. You leave the barrels in the aircraft when you do the turnaround, and you drop the whole magazine. That would go away, and in the time that it took to refuel the aeroplane, you could rearm it, because you just brought the next pack in, cranked it up, locked the guns in place. Matthew, one of the great records that we have in this museum starts at the end of World War II with the Mustang, the P-51. And that was actually being used deployed to Japan at the end of World War II to make sure that the Japanese complied with the alliances to stop them rearming and so on. And the squadron was just on the cusp of packing up and coming back to Australia when the North Koreans invaded South Korea. The story goes that the duty officer in the mess received a call from a US Air Force general, and was told that the war had broken out and they were on standby to go to war. And he used fairly explicit language, and of course the general eventually had to get through to the boss. So the squadron went from the position of being packing up and actually enjoying the party to cease operations in Japan when they had to start all over again. And they were used to escort American bombers to begin with, from Iwakuni and Japanese bases to bomb the North Koreans who were invading South Korea. And it became very clear very early on that the Mustang was not going to be employed as an interceptor. It was simply outclassed. Although the Russian or the North Korean Air Force at the time was very poorly equipped, nevertheless, there was the implicit situation where the Russians were going to back the North Koreans, which of course proved to be the case. And the North Koreans, or the Chinese particularly, had already been equipped with the MiG-15, which took the Allies very much by surprise. And it was of the era of the F-86. So the problem for the Royal Australian Air Force was then to continue operations in Korea, they needed a jet fighter. And the Brits were already producing the Meteor, which was the first British jet fighter. It was a very reliable jet. The engines particularly were reliable, and they were very happy for the Australian Air Force to have it. The Australian Air Force realised, of course, that they were going to be, the Meteor was effectively obsolete before it came into service, because it was a straight wing, just development of what was already existing. What they wanted was the F-86. The Americans were equipping their squadrons, so there were none available for the Australian Air Force. So the squadron was then equipped with the Meteor. And this particular Meteor is to commemorate Ron Guthrie. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Ron Guthrie. the number on the aeroplane is probably something of a misnomer because, of course, he was shot down in 721 at 38,000 feet. And it just so happened that Ron was a very lucky chap because he was equipped with one of the first Martin Baker ejection seats. So he was the first pilot to eject in combat. And there is a complicated story about what happened to him on the way down, but he ended up in North Korea as a prisoner of war. He did survive it and died not that many years ago of advanced old age, so it didn't do him any harm. During the Korean War, the Royal Australian Air Force lost something like 40 Meteors. And for a small Air Force, that's a lot of aeroplanes to lose. Combination of the fact that there was some lost in air-to-air combat, but the vast majority, because they used the aircraft for ground attack, were in ground attack situations where they were hit by small arms fire and low-level flak. There was also a major problem with the aircraft because it had handling problems. It was a twin-engined aeroplane, and the engines didn't spool up as quickly as piston engines. So fighter pilots who were used to getting low and slow on the approach, when they called for power, couldn't get the engines to react very quickly. So they ended up with a lot of aircraft in the undershoot. And also, most of them weren't very familiar with asymmetric flying, so they lost a lot in asymmetric accidents. So that was what happened with the Meteor in the Korean War. In the Royal Air Force, it was known as the meat box or the Widowmaker, just to give you an idea of the number of accidents that they had with it. The Royal Australian Air Force then managed to get the licensing rights to produce the F-86. So this was the aeroplane that the Royal Australian Air Force really wanted. And they got permission for the Commonwealth Aircraft Factory to build it under license in Australia. The engine that was nominated for it, that was the preferred option for the Royal Australian Air Force, was the Avon. And the reason for that was that there was commonality with the Canberra. The Canberra was already being built under license in Australia, and so was the Avon engine. Putting the Avon into the aircraft involved about a 60% redesign of the airframe. And there was an expectation that that would be a performance degradation on it. In the end, it proved itself to be a big advantage because the aircraft was probably, depends who you speak to, but it was probably the fastest of all the Sabres, a very effective aeroplane. And we come on now to the reason that that the F-86 came into service in the first place. The Meteor had a straight wing. That straight wing had all the transonic region problems that the big piston engines of World War II had. And the Germans had found in a lot of their research that the swept wing, and it was already known that the swept wing could actually help controllability of the aircraft in the transonic region. So first of all, by sweeping the wing, you can control the aeroplane better, and by having the all-flying tail, you gave the aircraft controllability. So there was about 100-knot advantage in the ability that this aircraft had of fighting it in combat. In addition to that, you'll see that the wing is a great deal thinner, which meant that the speeds for takeoff and so on were increased, and the need for reliance on prepared runways, whereas the Meteor could operate off pretty rugged type of airfields. But nevertheless, that's the way it was moving. And this aircraft came out, came into service in the 50s to combat the MiG, and then of course it was built under license in Australia. And it stayed in service with the Royal Australian Air Force until about 1971. The major difference between the American version of the F-86 and the Australian version was the size of the intake. Because of the effect, the Avon engine required a much higher mass flow to keep the aircraft operating, or the engine operating. Now, you remember I mentioned on the Hunter the fact that the engine tended to flame out because of the compressor stall. Okay, this aeroplane also had that same blast effect. And when they fired the 30mm cannons, the particulate would go down the intake, and had the problem also of causing the engine to surge. That was solved by putting baffles on. And you can see that the other major difference between this aircraft and the American version was that the American version had .5 machine guns, and this one had 30mm Aden cannons. Now, of course, in the big armament races of the late 50s, one of the biggest problems was that if you didn't go supersonic, nobody really wanted to know about it. And by the time the F-86 came into service, the fathers of the Air Force were already looking forward to what was going to come next. And they had a look at the Century Series fighters in America. So that they looked at these various options, and the one that they came up with was this one, the Mirage. And so it was allowed to be built under license in Australia. One of the other points about it was that they wanted to use the Avon engine as well, an afterburning version of it. And that was looked at, but it was considered at the end to be too expensive. So the package deal that they did with the French was for the Mirage 3 with the 8R engine in it. The 8R engine, of course, was one of those curious developments that originally came into its life as an option as the BMW 3 engine for the ME-262. And the French, in a very involved story, got the licensing rights to produce the engine, and they turned that into the 8R, which of course was a very successful engine. So that was the background to how the Mirage came into service. Supersonic, if you speak to the pilots, everybody who flew it really liked it. And it had the aerodynamics of that you expect from a Delta, but it was the advanced Delta that coped with the supersonics very well. It became clear that the rearmament that was going to take place after World War II was going to be centered around jet aeroplanes. And the Brits came up with the design of the Canberra. Now, it was a straight-winged aircraft, so it had all the transonic problems of lacking supersonic capability. But it also had the reliability of the jet engine, and it came into production in about 1951. And the production, if my memory serves me correctly, was then licensed in Australia in about 1954. A very successful aeroplane. It could actually out-climb and out-maneuver at altitude most of the fighters that existed at the time, although it wasn't a very fast aeroplane. Could carry an enormous bomb load, and the version that was so successful here in Australia was this one with the Avon engine mix, which we've already talked about from the F-86. This particular one is very dear to our hearts in the museum because it was our very first exhibit. If you look at the colour scheme on it, it's in the colour scheme that it was in when we first got it, which was 50 years ago. That's in 1974. So we've just had our 50th anniversary. When it was actually, as a first exhibit, it was bought by 3 enthusiasts. But they bought it from the Air Force, so they were given a very short timescale to get it off Amberley. And the aircraft was then taken down to an old coaching museum south of Brisbane, in Pioneer Valley. And there they had to reconstruct the aircraft and put it on exhibition there for a limited timescale. It was then moved to Nudgee. And then the drainage for the new airport started. So it was then moved to the airport. And for some reason, after it had been at the airport for an extended period, a number of years, the airport fathers suddenly decided they didn't want it there anymore. So the ultimatum that they gave the museum was effectively to jack up the rent. And it just so happened that the story got into the Courier Mail, and this home was offered to it, and it went on display here in 1986. And that was the beginning of this tremendous display that we've got here.
And indeed, it is a tremendous display at the Queensland Air Museum. We only covered a fraction of what was on display. Among some of the military aircraft, they have a Kiowa, an Iroquois, a Westland Wessex, Wirraway, Lockheed Ventura, a Vampire, and many others. We'd like to thank Val, Barry and John for showing us around, and Garry Hills for organising the visit for us. If you like these museum tours, have a look at our museum tour playlist where we go through half a dozen air museums with a particular emphasis on military aviation. And please support us by subscribing to our channel.